The committee will come to order. Before we begin, I have one housekeeping matter. In consultation with the ranking member, I plan to adjourn the public portion of this hearing at 1 p.m. and immediately move upstairs for the classified portion. Today, we continue our posture hearings with Africom and Centcom. I want to thank our witnesses for being here and their service to our nation and the time it took to prepare for this hearing. These are very helpful to us as policymakers. Earlier this month, we heard from the commanders of Northcom and Southcom about the growing presence of the Chinese Communist Party in North and South America. The situation in Africom and Centcom is even more concerning. Most countries in Africa and the Middle East are now members of the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative. The CCP built their first overseas military base in Djibouti at a strategic point on the Horn of Africa. This base can accommodate the CCP's aircraft carriers and sits only 6 miles from our own outpost. Now, they're actively looking to the Atlantic coast of Africa for a new military basing opportunity. Across the Middle East, the CCP is building ports, providing Huawei telecommunications, conducting joint military exercises, and delivering military equipment. But what worries me most is Xi's growing friendship with the Ayatollah. In the last few years, the CCP signed valuable trade deals with Iran, bought Iranian oil in defiance of international sanctions, and joined Russia in conducting joint drills with the Iranian Navy. Last week, they played peacemaker between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These actions provide a lifeline to Iran at a very dangerous time. The Ayatollah continues to fund and equip terrorists targeting American troops. He's providing Putin with advanced weapons to prosecute the brutal invasion of Ukraine, and his regime is aggressively pursuing nuclear weapons. We absolutely cannot allow that to happen. Finally, both General Langley and General Kurilla continue to face tremendous challenges snuffing out hardened terrorists in their AORs. In Africa, lack of adequate resourcing has led to worsening security situation, especially in the West, where the terrorist havens are expanding. In Centcom, President Biden's decision to unilaterally and unconditionally withdraw from U.S. forces from Afghanistan has undermined our national security. It has left a security vacuum with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS are all filling that vacuum. The assessment is that some of these terrorists could attack the U.S. within as little as 6 months. I remain very concerned that we are no longer positioned to detect an imminent attack and stop it. That's because the president's so-called over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy is a farce. Without persistent ISR, reliable partners on the ground, and nearby facilities to launch assets, our ability to strike these terrorists is severely limited. I look forward to this afternoon's classified discussion on the capabilities we've lost and how we can help restore them. We cannot allow for blind spots, especially in these two AORs. With that, I yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Dr. Wallander, General Kurilla, and General Langley joining us today, and I appreciate your leadership in these issues. And I think that the chairman started in the place where I think most members are going to be most interested, and that is the role of China and Russia in both of your AORs. As we know, it is growing, and I think the chairman did a pretty good job of describing it in the challenge that we face to balance against this. And I think it's important to understand why that matters, and actually it's one aspect of General Langley's AOR that sort of drives home that point, and that's West Africa, where the Wagner Group has been so active in taking over a security role, and we've seen the coups and the violence and the chaos that has followed. Certainly, we continue to have the challenge of the violent extremist organizations operating there, but Russia and China's presence is making that worse. So we need to make sure that we figure out how to effectively counter that, and that's what I'm most interested in hearing. As we're working with all of the countries spread out throughout Africom and Centcom, they are working with China and Russia for reasons. There are things that they see to their individual country's advantage. It's not enough for the U.S. to show up and say, we're better than them, you have to be with us. We have to understand in great detail why these countries are working with China. Why are they working with Russia? What is being offered by China and Russia that we aren't offering? How can we effectively counter that? Work with partners globally as well to make sure that China and Russia don't begin to have dominant control in those parts of the world. Without question, that's the #1 biggest challenge in these, is to understand how we balance that out. And then very specifically within Africa, we do continue to be concerned about the terrorist groups that are present there. I mentioned West Africa briefly, but we would love to have an update also on what's going on with Somalia. Al-Shabaab continues to be the most well-organized and effective arm of al-Qaeda. How is that fight going? And speaking of unilateral decisions, President Trump's unilateral decision in the dying days of his administration to simply pull out of Somalia without any sort of plan to follow up also had consequences, and would be curious to see what we're doing in that part of the world to deal with that. And then in the Middle East, Iran was mentioned, but the other thing that I think we need to really think about is in Iraq. We have had a presence there now since 2003. That presence has varied in terms of its purpose. Certainly in the 2015-16 timeframe, it was very focused. ISIS had risen, it was a profound threat, and we showed up to help our partners in that region to quell that threat. What is our presence in Iraq right now doing? Well, how is our partnership with Iraq? As the chairman noted, we are clearly targets for what Iran and their proxies are doing. What is our mission there? Who are our partners? And going forward, what should be our mission in that part of the world? These are two very interesting commands. We look forward to your testimony to help enlighten us as the challenges there, and most importantly, how we can be helpful in making sure that we meet the national security needs of our country in those regions and help all of you do your jobs in that region. With that, I yield back and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, sir. We will now introduce the witnesses. We have the Honorable Celeste Wallander, is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. General Eric Kurilla is the Commander of United States Central Command, and General Michael Langley is the Commander of United States Africom. I want to welcome my witnesses, and Dr. Wallander, we'll start with you for 5 minutes to give us your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. As the Department of Defense articulated in the 2022 National Defense Strategy, a strong, principled, adaptive U.S. military is a central pillar of U.S. leadership. This strategy sets out how the U.S. military will address growing threats to vital national security interests and a stable and open international system. It is focused on combining our strengths to maximum effect through integrated deterrence, by campaigning to disrupt destabilizing activities and push back against competitors' coercive actions, and by undertaking reforms and making investments to build enduring advantages. The Department remains committed to using our instruments to further U.S. interests in the Middle East and Africa. We will continue to stand with our partners and allies to win what we view as the competition of coalitions that is becoming increasingly critical to our common security. The Department's priorities in the Middle East are to promote stability and security, maintain credible military options to deny Iran a nuclear weapon, counter Iran's destabilizing activities, disrupt violent extremist organizations, or VEOs, safeguard freedom of navigation throughout global waterways, and work with Israel to ensure its security. The Department maintains readiness to unilaterally respond to any crisis or contingency, but our preference is to work alongside interoperable and capable partners within coalitions. This emphasis on consultation and cooperation is the U.S. competitive advantage in the Middle East. Though others seek to strategically compete, there is no combat credible, willing alternative prepared to share cutting-edge capabilities and invest vital national resources in support of regional security and defense of others within the rules-based international order. Iran is a persistent threat across a range of domains, most notably its nuclear program, support for Iran-aligned militia groups in Iraq, and the proliferation of advanced conventional weapons and attack drones. In Iraq and Syria, the Department remains committed to the enduring defeat of ISIS, both through military activities and by working with interagency partners to support comprehensive whole-of-government approaches to deliver security and stability. In Yemen, U.S. policy objectives remain focused on creating the conditions to implement a durable resolution under UN auspices that will end the now 8-year conflict. Within the Middle East, U.S.-Israeli military exercises demonstrate our ongoing work to improve our interoperability and increase military cooperation. And as Israel's alignment to U.S. Centcom's AOR matures, there will also be increased focus on working multilaterally with other partners throughout the region, including strategic partners in the Gulf. Africa's geopolitical importance to U.S. national security must not be overlooked. Many of the world's most pressing challenges and global solutions will emanate from this continent as it continues to grow in political and economic power. Africa's extraordinary potential is threatened by episodes of political instability, democratic backsliding, transnational threats, the entrenched and growing presence of EEOs, and the impact of climate in a complex operating environment. The Department takes an African-led, U.S.-enabled approach in close coordination with allies and partners to address security challenges. The Department prioritizes disrupting VEOs that threaten the homeland and vital U.S. national security interests, and supports a holistic approach to the security challenges in Africa through robust cooperation. This approach ensures that U.S. security and governance initiatives mutually reinforce each other to address the transnational nature of threats. In East Africa, we remain steadfast in our support of regional initiatives to counter the threat from al-Shabaab in Somalia. In West Africa, we remain focused on countering ISIS and JNIM in the Sahel by investing in and supporting our security partners. The security situation continues to deteriorate in the Sahel and coastal West Africa. Growing threats presented by VEOs, governance challenges, and a lack of development opportunities have exacerbated conflicts in the region. Recent political transitions challenge U.S. military assistance as well as access and influence to help counter advances by malign actors, namely Russia and the PRC. The PRC is the only country with the intent and increasingly the capability to fundamentally reshape the rules-based international order, and Africa is key to U.S. strategy to prevent the PRC from achieving its objectives. With the support of Congress, the Department of Defense remains positioned to support our allies and partners, compete with Russia and the PRC, and deter and defeat our adversaries across the Middle East and Africa. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wallander. General Kurilla, you're recognized.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I'm joined by Command Master Chief Fleet Derek Walters, the command's senior enlisted leader of U.S. Central Command. On behalf of the soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines, Coast Guardsmen and Guardians who serve this command, the Central Region, and the nation every day, thank you for allowing me to testify regarding the posture of U.S. Central Command. This year is the 40th in our Centcom history. In January of 1983, the United States Congress authorized the establishment of Centcom to serve as the security guarantor in the Middle East, the Levant, and the Central Asian states. Today, we rely heavily on partnerships the command has developed, and Centcom serves as the security integrator of the world's Central Region. The story of this command between 1983 and today is one that parallels the threats and opportunities of the region it supports for the past 4 decades. Central Command was formed to counter the influence of the revolutionary regime that had seized power in Tehran and to compete strategically with the Soviet Union. The organization's original charter was to direct and enable military operations and activities with partners to increase regional stability in support of American interests. That mission remains essentially unchanged to this day. Iran remains the focus. We now battle violent extremist groups who threaten the United States or interests in the region. The Soviet Union has been replaced with China and Russia as strategic competitors. The region remains vitally important to the nation and the world. Ours is an area of responsibility that encompasses 21 nations, 600 million people, and serves as the strategic nexus of the world's most important corridors of trade. Today, Centcom's priorities are to deter Iran, counter violent extremist organizations, and compete strategically with China and Russia. That is what we do. 4 decades after Centcom's formation, Iran remains the primary destabilizing element in the region. We've seen rapid advances in Iranian military capability over time. The Iran of 2023 is not the Iran of 1983. In fact, Iran today is exponentially more militarily capable than it was even 5 years ago. Today, Iran possesses the largest and most diverse missile arsenal in the Middle East, with thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles. Iran also maintains the largest and most capable UAV force. Iran's vast and deeply resourced proxy forces spread instability throughout the region and threaten our regional partners. Iran continues to enrich uranium far above what is needed for commercial use. Iran can enrich uranium far faster it could even 2 years ago. An Iran with a nuclear weapon would change the Middle East overnight and forever. As Iran continues to destabilize the region, we continue to fight violent extremist organizations. 4 years ago today, March 23rd, 2019, was a historic day in Centcom's 40-year lifespan. In Baghouz, Syria, the global coalition eliminated the last so-called ISIS territorial caliph. This historical achievement did not come without loss. During the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, tens of thousands of our partner forces were wounded or killed. Our partners were fully in the lead. 20 American service members were killed and dozens were wounded. They will always be remembered throughout U.S. Central Command by their countrymen for their sacrifice in defense of stability in the region. Today, we continue the fight against ISIS in Syria alongside our Syrian Democratic Force partners to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. And we remain in Iraq to advise, assist, and enable the Iraqi security forces in the fight against ISIS. In Afghanistan, ISIS Khorasan seeks to expand its ranks and develop the capability to inspire, enable, or direct attacks in the region and beyond, with the group's ultimate goal to attack the U.S. homeland. Amidst these challenges, strategic competition is deeply manifest in the region. The People's Republic of China aggressively expands its informational, military, and economic instruments of national power across the region. And now, Beijing seeks to establish its diplomatic influence. China, dependent on the region for over half of its imported crude oil and more than a third of all its natural gas, is also moving beyond energy-based investments to encompass physical and telecommunications infrastructure that advances its Belt and Road initiatives. 19 of 21 Centcom countries have signed a Belt and Road agreement with China. We are in a race to integrate with our partners before China can penetrate the region. Russia, on the other hand, seeks to expand its influence in Syria, seeking a permanent basing there and undermining our efforts towards stability and security. Putin seeks a foothold of influence in the Central Asian states, leveraging historical relations and a perceived decline in U.S. engagement to challenge our influence in this area of the world. With these challenges, the Centcom region holds the greatest risk of derailing the national defense strategy with a flashpoint international incident that may demand a response using unplanned resources or attention. That is why we require a sufficient and sustainable force posture to accomplish these missions without relying on additional forces. And to accomplish these strategic priorities, Centcom focuses on a strategic approach centered on people, partners, and innovation. People are our greatest asset and our most critical resource. Our partners are the nation's comparative advantage against competitors like China and Russia. And across Centcom, we cultivate deep, abiding partnerships that can serve as a hedge against threats in the region, while deterring Iran from its most destructive behavior. And China views our partners as merely customers and clients. Innovation of thought, innovation of process, innovation of concept, and technology extends the value of our partnerships, and innovation allows us to move faster, operate more efficiently, and increase progress across all operational efforts. So deter Iran, counter violent extremist organizations, and compete strategically are what we do. People, partners, and innovation, that is how we do them. In closing, let me thank you again for the support of our service members, civilians, and their families. For 40 years, much of that time in sustained combat and Centcom area of responsibility, the United States and the region relied on the American service member for the security and stability of the region and to advance American interests. Those men and women have fulfilled the original promise of this command and in some of the toughest circumstances, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. It is the greatest honor of my lifetime to be their commander.
Thank you, sir. General Langley, you're recognized.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished committee members, it's an honor to appear before you today to testify on the state of affairs of the United States Africa Command. I'm proud to testify alongside my dedicated colleagues, General Kurilla and Assistant Secretary Wallander. Now, I assumed command last August, and since then, I've embarked upon a campaign of learning. And over the last 7 months, all to inform this discussion today. I undertook this campaign of learning to fulfill my commitment to this Congress and complete a holistic assessment upon confirmation. Now, I made that assessment, and I will continue it throughout my tenure of command. Up front, I want to make one thing crystal clear. The team of service members and civilians at Africom is a talented and dedicated body. I'm honored to serve among them. I'm joined today by my State Department Foreign Policy Advisor, Mr. Phil Nelson, who represents the exceptionally skilled diplomatic team embedded at our headquarters. Our entire team is laser focused on implementing our whole of government approach with our partners from the Department of State, U.S.A, the intelligence community, and other U.S. government organizations. We campaign with our allies and partners to advance mutual interests and promote stability and prosperity on the African continent. You should be proud of their efforts. I know I certainly am. Africa is a vast and dynamic continent of sovereign nations. Collectively and individually, these nations are increasingly important players on the global stage. And as such, Africom's contribution to American security must be viewed through a global lens. Threats once contained on the continent are transforming into worldwide threats. Terrorism, poverty, food insecurity, climate change, and mass migration shatter African lives. They sow the seeds of violent extremists and Russian exploitation. The Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine has aggravated the food insecurity crisis in Africa by blocking vital food shipments to the same nations that feel the deepest impacts of climate change. Russia's Wagner mercenaries turn chaos into cash and destabilize entire regions across the African continent, and it cuts at American interests worldwide. The expansion of Middle East-based violent extremist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, including the biggest franchise of Al-Shabaab, threatens American lives. Solutions to these colossal problems must be a shared burden. African nations need to be at the helm of the concerted international efforts to produce sustainable outcomes. Assisting African nations in achieving their goals while advancing American interests can only be accomplished through a synchronized whole-of-government strategy. We call it the 3D approach, which is the toolkit of diplomacy, development, and defense. But one tool does not succeed without the whole kit. So I will advocate for State Department and U.S.A partners to receive the resources they need to succeed. Now, Africa faces many challenges. However, putting Africa's needs at the forefront of our campaign, reinforced by multilateral and whole government engagement, will help Africom and our partners work towards a sustainable peace, stability, and prosperity. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Thank all of you for your opening statements and for your service. I now recognize myself for questions. General Kurilla, you assess that ISIS-K can conduct an attack on the U.S. or Western interests abroad in 6 months or less. What could we do as Congress to help you best be prepared to thwart that or at least detect it?
Thanks, Chairman. And when I say capable of conducting an attack in under 6 months, there's 3 types that we look at. An inspired attack that's inspired by their vile ideology. They can do that today, they could do that tomorrow. There's an enabled attack where they are providing funding in some direction to be able to do that, and then there's a directed attack where it is command and controlled from the region to do that. Really what we see right now is their ability to do that in under 6 months is the enabled attack against U.S. or Western interests abroad, obviously much harder to do against the homeland. So part of that is our ability to increase our intelligence and collection efforts inside of Afghanistan. We are working right now with the department. We have received funding to increase our alternative airborne ISR, and we should have some systems coming online that is a 400% increase in the ability to collect over the top. We're trying to increase our other forms of intelligence, SIGINT, HUMINT, to enable us to penetrate those networks to target better.
Great. General Langley, the CCP has built a base in Djibouti. They've announced they're building a spaceport there, and they're looking to build a naval base on the Atlantic coast of Africa. Could you tell us the impact of those plans and what we can do to help you best thwart those?
Chairman, what I'm concerned about is the strategic implications. I'm concerned about that these aspirations of space base or any other technologies that can be dual use into military uses that the PRC or the CCP will establish a platform for power projection that changes America's strategic calculus going forward. We need to be concerned, and what I have at my disposal is become and maintain the partner of choice as we engage with our African nations. In my travels across the, Chairman, in my travels across the continent, our partners don't want to be militarized in a strategic sense. That's what I need to be able to articulate to them in my engagements.
Great. I'm curious, there's a concern that we may not be able to get appropriations bills passed on time. If we were not to be able to get a defense authorization bill passed on time, what would the implications of a CR be to you and your AOR? And I'll start with you, General Langley.
Chairman, first of all, it affects readiness. As we do the calculus of risk to force, risk to mission, the readiness of our forces, as the violent extremist organizations and the layered threat of the PRC and also Wagner's actions, it increased risk. We need new starts to be able to address these challenges. A delayed budget will hamper our new starts to address those issues.
Great. General Kurilla.
Hey, Chairman, thank you. We require a sufficient, timely, and predictable funding. Bottom line, it affects readiness. As Mike Langley said, one of the key issues, we can't have new starts, and we will see that affect readiness for forces coming forward in our allocated forces.
Okay. General Langley, I'm curious, you made reference to Russian activity in the African continent. Have you seen any diminution of that activity given their focus on Ukraine and their devotion of resources there, or has it been uninterrupted?
Chairman, first and foremost, let me state that Wagner and Vinny Prigozhin, they're about power and profit, and they do this and engaging. They fill a void of where we are not, where we have backed off because of one reason or another. They are the vanguard for the Russian Federation, and they are a cash for profit agency, and there is a revenue stream of what they garner on through their illicit activities on the African continent goes up to Putin.
Great. I'm interested, General Kurilla, one of my frustrations about the way we left Afghanistan was we did not maintain a base anywhere in Afghanistan from which we could conduct ISR. Can you tell me how adequate, or if it is adequate, what you're receiving now in the way of ISR? I know we're going to talk more about this in the classified section, but can you, in a public way, talk about how adequate it is or inadequate?
So I have validated requirements right now for ISR. We are not filled completely to our validated requirement. One of the challenges I have is the time I spend in transit. About 80% of the time is spent in transit to get to Afghanistan, but we are working with some alternative airborne ISR, like I said, high duration, stuff that can stay up for days, and we're working towards programs and platforms that can stay up for weeks.
Great. Recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. So focusing on China, well, to some degree Russia's role, but the treaty or the reopening of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia that China just recently negotiated, part of that is that Iran says publicly that they're going to stop sending arms to Yemen, to the Houthis in Yemen, which would be, a significantly positive step. So I guess the first question is, do you believe that? Do you see that coming out? Do you see some positive aspects of Iran and Saudi Arabia reestablishing diplomatic ties?
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. So I think there is goodness anytime tensions can be lowered. An agreement is not implementation. While they were negotiating this, over the last 90 days, we stopped 5 major shipments of Iranian arms that were going to the Houthis, and some of those were advanced components like inertial navigation systems for short-range ballistic missiles. And I think that what we should be concerned about in this is that China is the one that mediated this. It was being done by 2 countries in the Middle East over the last 2 years, but what it shows is that China, not only do they have their economic, information, and military instruments of national power being coming into the region, we are now seeing really for the first time their diplomatic instrument of national power.
Yeah, and Dr. Wallander, I'd just sort of follow up on that from a policy standpoint, because This room is kind of conditioned to not be fond of China, and that's where the conversation goes, and that's fine. But looking at the broader world, we're talking about Chinese involvement. We'll leave the Russians out of it for the moment. You know, they are doing a huge development initiative throughout Africa, and now they're negotiating, you know, well, peace treaty is the wrong word, but they're negotiating between Iran and Saudi Arabia. If you're in Africa, if you're in the Middle East, you know, what's our argument for why China's a problem, and frankly, how do we balance? And I understand the nefarious aspects of what China's up to, but how do we effectively make that case to these countries that we're trying to make our partners, as opposed to, I think everyone in this room is going to be there, but we're not the ones we're trying to persuade. We're trying to persuade the countries out there that they need to be careful about their relationships with China and Russia. How do we do that in light of those facts?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I share your assessment and what General Kurilla laid out as his concerns. I think that what our duty and our argument to countries in the Middle East and Africa is that we want to work with them on common interests to improve their capabilities for national security and stability. Whereas the track record of China and Russia in the form of Wagner actually comes in for their narrow national interests, often is, as we've seen a track record of China going in with what sounds like very tempting deals, which end up on the back end costing countries quite a lot and providing a lot less capability. So the track record is something we can point to, and we're beginning to see that effect. In Africa, Wagner is beginning to not have the stellar reputation that the Russian government would like to claim that it has.
And what I would strongly suggest is that we need to make that case, and we need to make it better. I think there's a tendency, at least in the pronouncements that I hear, just like, we're the U.S., we're good, they're China, they're bad, therefore you have to agree with us. I can assure you, and everyone at this table, the rest of the world doesn't look at it that way. They look at a mixed record coming from us. They look at their needs. I think we are right. I think our role in the world is incredibly important. I think the alliance that we put together and the idea of a rules-based international order is vastly better than China's debt traps and China's desire to come in and extract resources, China's autocratic approach. Crucially, you know, if you say anything, I mean literally anything that China doesn't like, they'll cut you off at the knees, okay? That's the argument we need to be making. I mean, South Africa is out there doing joint exercises with Russia and China, and we're going, don't do that. We need a better argument. It's really crucial that we do that. Just in the last couple of minutes, on my question I raised in the first place, what are we doing in Iraq right now? What's our plan? Why are we there? What's the mission?
So Iraq is a strategic partner, Congressman, and what we are doing there is for the enduring defeat of ISIS. We are partnered with the Iraqis and obviously the Syrian Democratic Forces. We did 313 partnered operations last year. We've done 129 this year to date. And those are Iraqis in the lead or Syrian Democratic Forces in the lead. The Iraqis just did a major large-scale operation where we are providing some of the intelligence and the fires aspect of that to go after the enduring defeat of ISIS. There's about 20,000 ISIS detainees inside of Iraq. And when we can get to them where they can do this on their own, that's when we'll know when we see the enduring defeat of ISIS.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I yield back.
Good morning, everybody. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. General Kurilla, I'm extremely concerned about the rapid progress Iran has made on its nuclear program. Earlier this month, the IAEA said that Iran has produced uranium particles that were enriched up to 83.7%. Last week, you testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that Tehran can now produce sufficient fissile material for a nuclear weapon in less than 14 days. Iran is on the brink of being a nuclear weapon state, which would change the security layout of the Middle East in unpredictable ways. So, General, what activities or plans are you engaged in to reinforce U.S. deterrence and convey to Iran that acquiring nuclear weapons will not be in its best interest?
Thank you, Congressman. I mean, the U.S. policy is Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. I think anything about plans that we have against any nuclear program would be best in a classified setting.
Thank you, and we will bring that topic up in the classified setting. And Dr. Wallander, do you have anything to add to that here in this public setting?
Just to endorse or support your assessment of the challenge, and to reiterate that the role of the Department of Defense is to provide the Secretary of Defense and the President with military options for the prevention of Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons.
Okay, well, thank you both. Further on Iran, they are posturing to be more than just a regional challenge. Over the course of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Iran has increasingly provided military support to Russia, specifically drones. Russia is planning to provide Iran with advanced capabilities, including military fighter jets, helicopters, and air defense systems. So, and they're also planning to jointly build a drone factory inside Russia that would produce thousands of drones per year. This has more than just regional impact for Iran. So how is Centcom posturing to respond to this increasing collaboration between Iran and Russia, and what do you assess the implications to be for the region?
Congressman, it is very concerning with this relationship that Iran and Russia have. We are seeing them move the UAVs to Russia, be able to use them in Ukraine, and these are the very same UAVs that they use to attack our forces in Iraq and Syria, and they're improving upon them. And we saw Iranian state media publicly announce that they'll be getting Su-35, which is a fourth-gen plus fighter aircraft. They'll be providing those. We think that'll happen at some point this year. And it is this closer collaboration between two adversaries that is concerning. What we are doing is building the regional partnerships in the region to be able to counter that.
And what about the, I think it's called the S-400 air defense system that Russia is saying it will provide to Iran?
We have not seen the S-400 be provided to Iran, but Iran also produces very capable indigenous air defense systems as well.
Okay. Thank you. And Dr. Wallander, do you have anything to add to what General Kurilla just said?
I just want to especially note the importance of the work of Centcom in creating regional constructs for integrating and improving the capabilities of partners in the region to push back and defend against the growing threat of Iran.
Thank you. And lastly, General Kurilla, there are numerous efforts underway in Congress this year to enhance U.S. and Israeli collaboration on future warfare technologies. I have a lengthy amendment in the NDAA on this, for instance. This would include working together on directed energy, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, missile defense, space, and other cutting-edge programs. Do you support efforts to provide Israel with additional capabilities to ensure that it can effectively respond to enhanced Iranian threats that we've been already talking about?
Thank you, Congressman. We are committed to the defense of Israel. We work very, very closely with them and a lot of their new technologies. I have been to the country multiple times and looked at everything from their ballistic missile defense, their counter-UAS, and a lot of their advanced technologies like their Iron Beam that they are coming out with, and we also are coming out with our own directed energy systems as well.
Excellent. And Dr. Wallander, anything to add to that?
You know, the United States has an ironclad commitment to the defense of Israel and manifested most recently in the extraordinarily successful Exercise Juniper Oak, which exercised and demonstrated the level of interoperability and capability and the ability of the United States, Centcom in particular, to surge that capability and work closely with Israel to exercise and also demonstrate that capability.
Very good. Thank you all for being here. I now recognize Representative Courtney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. General Langley, it was striking to me in your testimony sort of where you contrasted sort of Russia's entry into particularly countries like the Central African Republic using basically the Wagner Group as the sort of enticement to get into that country and other countries like it, whereas China is using more of an economic investment sort of approach in terms of trying to, again, ingratiate itself to these countries as well. So going back to the Wagner Group sort of enterprise, can you just sort of describe what does Wagner Group in Russia get out of that? Are they getting sort of, and there's been reporting that they basically get paid or reimbursed or compensated by gold, diamonds, other materials and minerals that obviously are valuable?
Congressman, absolutely. Wagner has ill intentions their destabilizing activity. They have a history of it on the continent. And then, as we can see in the Central African Republic, and there are no good stories in their entrenchment in Libya as well, and now Mali. I am concerned about that. That's a layered threat that we're really concerned that they are the vanguard of the Russian Federation, because they have a thinly veiled false value proposition that says we're going to provide security for you, especially nations that have been affected by a coup. That's what happened in Mali. And then they come up their invoice. And whereas only security they actually provide is the bubble around the elite, or those that were that initiated the coup in the first place. And there's also a roadmap to rare earth minerals or diamonds or gold. There's Benny Boghossian is all about power for profit. What we're doing, Congressman, is initiating a campaign plan with our OAIs across the whole government approach to suppress this. And I can get more specific on what we're doing in the closed session.
And again, China's approach is again, using its sort of economic muscle to again, and I think it was described, I mean, it's a bait and switch, type of plan. But so 5 days ago, there was an incident in the Central African Republic where 9 Chinese nationals were gunned down in broad daylight at a gold mine. Again, the initial claim by the government was that it was rebel forces that were responsible for that mass shooting. Last night, there was actually reporting that eyewitnesses described that the perpetrators were actually Wagner Group, which is kind of an interesting colliding autocracies playing itself out in that continent. Xi Jinping actually stopped and interrupted the summit he had a few days ago with Putin to condemn this shooting and promised that there would be a full investigation to get to the bottom of it. But again, it was kind of it's hard to get your head around the way that, again, these two exploitative autocracies are now basically almost like scorpions in a bottle, where their approach to this part of the world is now even possibly creating conflict amongst themselves. So Dr. Wallander, I don't know if you want to comment on that. That actually, going back to Mr. Smith's comments, is maybe an opportunity for us to really show that neither one of these players are really going to create stability or prosperity in this part of the world, and there's a better way to proceed.
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, we are very clear with partners particularly in West Africa, in the evidence that Wagner brings not security and stability for their countries, but in fact is an entry point for economic exploitation, for instability, actually extraordinary and horrifying assaults on civilians in these countries, because what Wagner offers is regime security, not national security to these countries. I would say on this China-Russia issue, that is an interesting incident, and we'll have to track it more closely. I am more struck by the consonance and the alignment of strategic interests at the level of Xi and Putin, and that's the real challenge we have going forward, that they share an interest in undermining global security and the rules-based international order and use one another to advance their national goals, but often those goals are very complementary.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wallander, General Kurilla, General Langley, thank you all so much for joining us. General Kurilla, General Langley, I want to begin with you. If we look at where we are today as necessarily focused on this era of great power competition with China and Russia, I believe that potentially opens up a door for an opportunity for a black swan event. And my question is, based on your testimony, General Kurilla, beginning with you, where you said a flashpoint with Iran, a crisis in the region, a successful large-scale attack on a partner country, or an attack on the homeland by a VEO would necessarily redirect resources away from Central Command, or, excuse me, away from other areas to Central Command. I think that's meaningful. General Langley, you said an underinvestment in African security raises the risk of an unexpected crisis that would abruptly strip U.S. resources away from our top national security challenges in that arena, a great power competition. Gentlemen, in your professional military judgment, do you assess that the shift in great power competition and resources and focus by the United States increases the risk of a black swan event? And do you believe, though, that our military building capability to address great power competition in any way would deter a black swan event? And thirdly, do you believe that efforts by either Russia or China are adding to the potential of any actors out there that may be interested in perpetrating a black swan event?
Congressman, thanks for that question. An interesting question. So when I took command in the first month, at the end of the first month, we had a commander's conference, and one of it, each group had to come up with 2 black swan events that they could see happening. We had 12 of them. At the end of this, we briefed them all. We found that 11 of the 12 were actually highly likely, or were at least probable that could occur. And by definition, they're no longer a black swan event. But I think to your question about preparing for or doing strategic competition, does that take away from not being able to see a black swan event? I don't think so, because I think when you are preparing and you're doing strategic competition, you are increasing the capability of your military force, and that includes the intelligence gathering apparatus. And I think it helps us be able to see some of those things that we might not otherwise be able to see.
Very good. General Langley?
Congressman, the NDS, our National Defense Strategy, tells me to specified and implied to monitor and respond. I need to be able to identify indications and warnings. One capability in a posture-limited and economy of force command is a decrement of our ISR capabilities. That is the foundational piece that I need, and it's also on my unfunded priority list of being able to bolster that capability so I can see those black swans, so I can provide indications and warnings, and so we can reposition assets. Or I go to my colleague, General Kurilla, to assist, and we can aggregate some of our forces to do that. But at this point now, that's what pressurizes our efforts of exploitation. It's a layered threat here. So yes, answer to your last question, any exploitation by the violent extremist organization, I say yes. That's why I need increased ISR to address all of those issues.
Very good. Thank you. Gentlemen, let me ask too, you laid out that you have assessed this particular situation, those risks. In your assessment, where do you believe the greatest risk exists? And General Langley, you talk about maybe needing more ISR to be able to even further define that risk. But from both your professional judgments about what you see today, what's the greatest risk? And what do you have currently that you're using to mitigate that risk? And what might you need in order to do everything possible to make sure that we deter those actors that may be wanting to perpetrate a black swan event?
Congressman, for us, our greatest risk is with Iran right now. That is why it is our #1 priority to deter them. And then I would tell you it's the violent extremist organizations that we are seeing, the ISIS Khorasan group in Afghanistan. And what we're doing is we're applying our resources to both of those efforts. We look at those also through our partners to be the regional constructs to deter Iran. And again, it's increasing our capability and intelligence inside of Afghanistan.
Very good. General Langley?
Congressman, again, on the African continent, it's a layered risk. It's a layered threat. So my first and immediate, as I engage with our partners, because it is going to be partner-led, U.S. enabled, it is violent extremist organizations, and how do we address that? So that segues into how we address that through our programs, our portfolios of security force assistance. As we look at 333, Title 10, to train and equip or build institutional capacity in 332, that's what we need to address this. But we do have a pacing threat, and we do have that immediate threat as well. And that's where it's going to be a whole of government approach, collectively, all the OAIs coming together and putting together a value proposition to our African partners to deter them becoming the partner of choice.
Very good. Thank you to our witness. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Garamendi from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wallander, General Kurilla, and General Langley, thank you very much for the testimony today and your insight into the issues. I'd like to focus on Africa here, and specifically, General Langley and Dr. Wallander, you mentioned the whole of government. It's rather obvious that it's not within our current military capability to deal with all of Africa. So, Dr. Wallander, if you could talk to us about what you see the State Department, U.S.A.I.D. and U.S. private investment could and should be doing in Africa to address the problems that have been discussed here.
Thank you, Congressman. It's an excellent question, and I would point to as a signature a signature element of that whole of government approach, including the private sector, the African Leaders Summit that was so successful in December of last year. There were elements of that summit that were focused on defense and security, on diplomacy, on development, and there was a significant private sector involvement in the discussions about how to advance security, stability, and prosperity in Africa. The Department of Defense works closely with U.S.A.I.D. to support their programs when they need assistance and when they need Africom support. And we work very closely with the Department of State in advancing governance, rule of law, institution building. When we talk about security assistance, a lot of our security assistance is focused not merely on train and equip, but also on building civil-military relations, resilience, and capacity of our partner governments so that they have that strong governance structure to be able to advance policies for their countries across the board.
Well, thank you. General Langley, same subject area.
Thanks for the question, Congressman, because the whole of government conceptually will work, can work, but we need to address some issues. As I look at U.S.A.I.D. and I talk to some of the administrators over there and even administrative power, says that their non-humanitarian efforts to put the full throws or horsepower into the whole of government approach, most of that funding is earmarked. So they can't do in-stride adjudication, they can't do in-stride reallocation, I should say, to the problems brought to bear in some of the African countries, whether it be famine relief or any other thing of development across their governance. These African partners say that, holistically, the enduring solution to violent extremist organizations is good governance. To bolster the capacity in their governance, U.S.A.I.D. and State Department need flexible funding to address these current near-term issues. And just one point, as far as the military perspective, we add to that within our 333 programs, and we just want that to be more responsive as well.
333, explain, please.
I'm sorry, that's our, the 333 Title 10 authorities is authority that I have as these African countries are embarking upon the violent extremist organization fight. They need training and they need assistance within that. The 332 builds ministerial capacity so they can have, embark upon the whole of government approach to address these issues.
I would note that the Peace Corps is returning to Africa. At least I'm pleased about that. I want to deal with the violent extreme organizations, the relationship between the U.S. military and French in Mali and other of the Sahel areas. If General Langley and Dr. Wallander, if you could speak to that issue and where the French are and where they're not, and where we are and where we're not.
Yes, Congressman, I talk to the French weekly, and as their president came out with a new strategy, more of advise and assist and institution across, they are just moving some a piece on the chessboard. We still have the same strategy that's in line with each other to be able to help and enable, partner-led, but U.S.-enabled, to be able to ensure that they achieve their objectives. So I work with the French all the time, and our operational plans and campaigning are in line.
I'll yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. The Air Force is moving assets from EUCOM to INDOPACOM, and it just seems kind of strange that we would be moving those assets right now with everything going on in Ukraine. Do both of you have a need for additional air assets, or do you have the air assets that you currently need in Centcom and in Africom?
I have a requirement for additional air assets, Congressman.
Do you need A-10s in Centcom?
We have been given A-10s or have been approved to come to Centcom.
Okay. Are you being given what you've requested, or are you being shorted on your request?
So we have, 4 of the 5 NDS priorities are in the Centcom area. Every day I'm looking at the missions I have, the resources I've been allocated, and I'm dynamically balancing risk against those. And in a closed session, I can talk about specifically what some of those shortcomings are.
Okay. General Langley, thank you for your help when Congressman Panetta and I got to go to a couple of countries in Africa. We couldn't have done it without your assistance. The thing that sticks in my mind on that trip is Wagner and how effective they have been with social media. It's open source that the French ISR picked up mass graves where Wagner had killed a lot of people. By the time it made it to the public what had happened, Wagner had already hijacked the pictures and convinced the public that it was the French that had carried out the atrocities. I'm concerned about the speed at which we are handling unconventional warfare and how we're able to increase our pace to deal with what I consider to be a terrorist organization like Wagner. What discussions are happening about how we increase the pace of our unconventional warfare to compete with Wagner and others who don't have to operate by the rules?
Congressman, thanks for that question, because that's one of my concerns. We need to be able to operate at the speed of relevance. And as we consider in the military, as you well know, the OODA loop, to be able to observe, orient, decide, and act. And once Wagner does something like that through our military information support operations, we need to be able to go at that cadence, faster cadence that interdicts their illicit activities, especially their malign information activities. So we're working whole of government as well. State Department does have some programs in place as well to deter the ill effects of the information spate that Wagner's espousing.
I mean, speed is the key to it. Once people have already made up their mind, then it's hard to unmake it, especially in those countries. And I'm very concerned, and we met with the current leadership of Chad and some other countries about what is happening with the French, and there seems to be an attitude, might not be the right word, but kind of the belief that if they kick the French out of the country, that the U.S. is going to build an enduring mission. But it was the French Mirages that saved us in Tonga Tonga. My assessment is we would have lost everybody in Tonga Tonga had the French not had Mirages. Is that yours as well?
Congressman, I've read the Tonga Tonga report, and as every time we come around to matching capabilities and readiness assessment, we ask for more vertical lift, and we thank this Congress for the Warfighting Recovery Network. We bolster that, but I'm still going to be asking for more as we look at our reposture and as we're starting to expand our activities to address the violent extremist organization going into the Gulf of Guinea states as well. So that's going to be comparable to what I asked for in this coming budget. Over.
I appreciate both of you. I'll have more questions when we get to the other meeting. Look forward to coming back to Africa this year, General Langley, and seeing you over there again. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wallander. Sorry I didn't have any questions.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Houlihan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. General Kurilla, thank you as well for your testimony, and I was really excited to hear about Centcom's Innovation Oasis competition. And I think that you probably do think as well that some of the best ideas for innovation and best practices come from people who are on the front lines rather than not necessarily the leadership. So I was hoping you might be able to share a little bit more about the genesis of that idea. Are there any projects in particular that have come from that idea? And is there anything further that we can do here in Congress to be supportive of that initiative?
Thanks, Congresswoman. So Innovation Oasis is our Shark Tank-like idea, where what we do is we find some of the best ideas are trapped inside of a hangar, on a ship, in a cubicle, or down in a squad, and we use it as a way to elevate those ideas and then use the resources at Centcom to then promote those ideas. And we've received a lot of really good ideas. One of them was a counter UAS trainer. We had a bunch of proprietary systems out of there, and we created one, and one of our sergeants, an E5 from the Massachusetts National Guard, programmed it himself on the weekends and came up with a counter UAS trainer that we're able to use, and we're in the process of trying to advance that idea, putting the resources and energy of Centcom behind it. We have another one coming up in the end of May from each of the different components within Centcom. They'll pick their best person and send them up. And it's a chance really to elevate great ideas that are otherwise trapped inside a squad or a ship, et cetera. You know, it was Staff Sergeant Cahill from the New Jersey National Guard who figured out a way to break through the hedgerows at France. A staff sergeant figured that out.
And is there any kind of way that you guys are tracking those successes, and so that we can kind of continue to elevate them and encourage that sort of innovative thinking in what is otherwise sort of a stodgy kind of an organization? I say that as a former Air Force person myself.
Oh, ma'am, we do have a open portal website where people submit their ideas and people can see those.
Excellent, thank you. And General Langley as well, thank you for being here today. U.S. Africa Command is a relatively new combatant command, and it was designed from the start to lead with diplomacy, with development and defense in a supporting role, and that's fascinating. Until this last Congress, I was able to serve both on the Armed Services and the Foreign Affairs Committee, which I really enjoyed that kind of combination of defense as well as diplomacy. So as part of the combatant commander, and part combatant commander and part diplomat, how can you balance those roles? How are you able to balance those roles as you're working with the Department of State or U.S.A. to offer a whole of government support for our African partners? How are you finding that?
Congresswoman, thanks for asking that question. Because, yes, all my engagements on the continent, in these countries, they know that their solution to their immediate threats is violent extremist organizations, and they know that they need to create a holistic approach in their whole of government approach. So I always engage with assistant secretaries over at state or administrators over at U.S.A. to ensure that we can build that capacity. And they asked me to advocate for their need for more flexible funding or increased funding in the number of programs. But also on the back of that, Prosper Africa. These are the initiatives that this Congress has legislated. We need to get after that, especially the GFA, you know, formerly, well, actually now known as Prevent Conflict, Promote Stability. So holistically, that's what I have in discussions with the leadership of the countries that I engage with, being able to add more to that and more capacity to those programs. Full funding will be helpful.
If you would let us know if there are any further authorities or help and support that we can provide to allow that to be easier for you, that would be terrific. And with the last minute of my time, I wanted to talk a little bit about the threat posed by infectious diseases. I had a chance to go on a bicameral delegation with Senator Kuntz and Senator Portman this past summer, and particularly struck by the Cabera slums that I was able to visit and how dangerous an outbreak in those slums could be, or frankly a rural outbreak as well, that is a zoonotic one. Can you all speak a little bit more in a half a minute about what Centcom is doing on this issue and what we think we should be doing, or how Congress can be more helpful on that?
Congresswoman, I think it's by working with our partners on this to make sure that we identify the threat, and we're working with them as they help identify the needs.
I concur with Eric is saying. We bring this up with our partners and have that discussion, and it's going to be a partner-led on these initiatives, but we will enable.
Thank you. I've run out of time, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. J. Lay.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being here today. I'm going to start with General Kurilla and Dr. Wallander. As mentioned earlier in today's hearings, over the last few years, Iran and its proxies across the region have escalated their use of projectiles, particularly drones, to attack U.S. forces and U.S. allies. Can you give us an idea of how we are defending ourselves against these threats, and what does the data show about the performance of counter-UAS systems deployed in the region?
Thanks, Congressman. So what we do see is advanced capabilities that Iran is using. I do thank the services providing the counter-UAS capabilities that we do have in the region. It's a layered defense. No one system is effective against all. And so what we do is we look at the performance of the systems and look at ways to help improve them. We just finished a counter-UAS experimentation and live fire down in Saudi Arabia at our Red Sands Integrated Experimentation Center that we have down there. We finished that last week against complex threats to identify weaknesses in other areas that we can improve in the tactics, techniques, and procedures of those counter-UAS systems.
Can you share any numbers on performance percentage-wise of how we're doing against those assets?
I would have to take that for the record to give you the exact performance parameters.
Okay. Dr. Wallander, did you have anything to add?
I would just emphasize, in addition to the partnerships with countries in the region, that the focus of Centcom and also policy and support has been to emphasize the opportunities for integrated approaches where regional partners, especially in the Gulf, can work together to more comprehensively address the threats that you identified.
Okay. And we also talked earlier about the Iran nuclear deal, and Dr. Wallander, does it remain the policy of the United States to ensure that Iran will never acquire or develop a nuclear weapon?
Yes, Congressman. President Biden has made that clear.
Okay. Given the strides that the Iranian nuclear program has made, I'm not sure we should be confident that we won't be witnessing a rise of nuclear Iran in the near future. So how do you assess Centcom's ability to respond to an Iranian nuclear breakout?
Again, Congressman, I'll be happy to talk about the Iranian nuclear program in a closed session.
Okay, fair enough. There's probably no bigger threat to one of our greatest allies, Israel, than the Iranian nuclear program. Do you believe that if it became necessary, the IDF has the capabilities today to defend themselves against the rising threat of nuclear Iran?
I think Israel has the capability to defend itself against ballistic missiles. I think any discussion other than that on a nuclear program is best in a closed session, Congressman.
Okay. Do we have contingency plans being prepared to defend U.S. personnel and asset in CENTCOM's AOR against Iranian retaliation in the event of Israel's strike on Iran's nuclear program?
Congressman, we're always prepared to defend our forces that are in the region.
Okay. Just one final question, shifting to what impact the Ukraine war has had on Russia's posture in the Middle East. For instance, have we seen a reduced footprint in Syria?
A very small reduction in the footprint. We've seen some reduction in terms of munitions, but for the most part, they've maintained their force posture because it's very important, and it shows the importance that they place on Syria. And you saw that Assad just went to Moscow, and he welcomed a permanent Russian basing in the region.
We continue to observe Iran and its proxy shipping weapons to Russia for use against Ukraine. General, if you see such a shipment, say Iranian drones headed to Russia through your AOR, do you have the authority to interdict these shipments?
We have the authority to stop things that we can see inside of certain countries, but I think that's best in a closed session, Congressman.
Okay, and I'll save a few more questions for the closed setting. Thank you all for being here. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I think it is incredibly important that we don't take our eye off the ball in the Middle East, even as we rightly focus on the rising threat of China and the necessary deterrence initiatives in the Pacific. Dr. Wallander, back to this deal that the PRC was able to broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What do you think that this could mean for the region in the medium term? And what lessons should we learn from it with respect to how we compete with China outside the Indo-Pacific region?
So thank you, Congressman. I want to emphasize two points about what looks like a deal. As General Kurilla pointed out, it's an agreement. We'll see about implementation. One is that these were quiet talks that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran were having for some time about reestablishing embassies, exchanging diplomats. So China came in on the back end, played a role, but this is something that was in the works for a while. Second of all, if this contributes to greater security and stabilization in the region, if this does, and again, we're waiting to see, lead to an end to Iranian provision of capabilities and fueling of the conflict in Yemen and the threat that that has posed to other Gulf countries, that would be a welcome development. So we are in a watch and wait posture. But I also want to emphasize we are concerned about China's increased activity in the diplomatic front to present itself as a problem solver. And we will make clear to our partners, such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with which we have broad, deep, long-standing security, economic, and political ties, that we are a strategic partner of choice. And just because China came in at the end here and maybe helped seal a deal does not mean that the reliability and the long-standing partnership between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is something to discount.
So you're saying that China swooped in here at the last minute and took credit for the whole deal, which I think is something that we're all quite familiar with in the realm of politics and world affairs. If we get wind of the Chinese about to do something similar with perhaps another country in the Middle East and Iran, would it be wise for us to be the ones who swoop in and seal the deal, as you said?
We remain closely engaged with all of our partners in the region and are attuned to their security concerns, support their diplomatic efforts that are consistent with international law and advance stabilization and security. So we need to be forward-leaning, as you're suggesting, in working with our partners in the region so that they know the United States have their best interest at heart and they can count on us.
So if that's what we should do in the future, why didn't we do it in this case?
We have a close relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and I can't speak to the details of diplomatic discussions between countries that we were not privy to.
Okay. Well, I hope we go into this more in the classified session, because if we knew this was happening, I don't know why we wouldn't be the ones to get diplomatic credit here, especially when the alternative choice is the PRC. General Kurilla, we're tracking that in Syria, Russian military forces have been behaving unprofessionally towards U.S. forces and have repeatedly harassed our troops with low-flying aircraft. Could you please describe Russia's behavior in Syria towards our troops and how that has changed over the course of the conflict in Ukraine?
Thanks, Congressman. So what we see is their behavior is unprofessional and unsafe. Since 1 March, it's the highest number of tactical air flights over U.S. forces in areas since the beginning of the conflict, since Russia was in the AOR. Really starting on 1 March, when I talk tactical flights, that is fighter aircraft or air-to-ground aircraft flying over our area. We always have our own fighters. We'll intercept them, so we always have the ability to protect ourselves. But really, we are there for de-ISIS. They are under the guise of being there under de-ISIS. We do not see them doing a defeat ISIS role. When they're doing that, it's unnecessary, unsafe, and unprofessional.
Dr. Wallander, do you think there's an escalation risk here?
There's always a risk when Russian forces are behaving unprofessionally, and making sure to maintain American presence and appropriate responses is something we count upon from our military commanders, but escalation management is something that we know that they are mindful of as well.
Well, my time is up, but I would just say that if there's always a risk when Russian soldiers are behaving unprofessionally, it also seems that Russian soldiers always behave unprofessionally, and so we really have to manage this risk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, General Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my first question is for you, General Langley. And have you seen a shift in the Wagner forces available in Africa with the shift to Ukraine, or has it pretty much stayed consistent since they got more deeply involved in Ukraine?
Congressman, that's a great question. I have not seen a shift, but here's what my analysis would tell me, though, that they wouldn't have what you have on the African continent is a false value proposition of security. So I don't think they're going to have their experts on the continent of Africa for that purpose. They're going to have the businessmen that are trying to make their way to the mines for profit.
And I'm going to follow up on Seth Moulton's, because I agree with him. We need to be forward-leaning in diplomacy. And right now, the partner of choice around the world, whether that's South America or Centcom or Africom, is the United States military. However, our State Department sometimes make that very, very difficult. So we have Jackson Vanik and a lot of things that we punish people wholly when we see their policies don't align with U.S. Policies. And that's not a bad thing. There's a purpose for that. But do you guys see any way that we can do that on a sliding scale and a reward punishment basis as opposed to a wholesale, you acted bad, so therefore we're not going to do any IMET with your country anymore. We're not going to provide U.S.A. to your country anymore. We're not going to do anything where we completely cut them out and create a vacuum in those countries where they have to choose China or Russia because we're not available because of our State Department. And I use a prime example. I visited 5 countries in Africa last July, May or July, somewhere around that time frame. And I went to Tunisia, Burkina Faso, Chad, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. And in all those, we had State Department restrictions that were preventing us from being effective as a military as we can. What is the solution to this so that we can build those future leaders in those countries instead of just saying no, we can do an incentive-based program as opposed to just saying no? Any ideas?
Congressman, the 7008 sanctions on that country, but restrictions for me, I have to look at the whole government approach. For example, Burkina Faso, 708 was imposed, but I had to thank you for, I just really want to thank you for the language within the 8823 that says notwithstanding authorities. There are still some notwithstanding authorities. And that's why at Flintlock that we had last week, major exercise in West Africa, the Burkinabes were there. They were there. So until there's a message to them that they need to set the stage to return back to democratic norms. But across the whole government, I met with State Department last week, so they also have some activities and investments that they can do to be able to employ in Ouagadougou because Ambassador Clark, she's looking for what CT mechanism we can do to still engage with Burkina Faso so they can embark upon the fight against violent extremist organization.
Thank you. Let me kind of get it. I got one more question, but I think you're 100% right, and I just think we really have to work this problem set because there's a lot of opportunities that we're missing, and we're giving opportunities to our competitors by not using a reward system to modify behavior to our culture. The final thing, and General Kurilla, you've done an outstanding job in your predecessors. The state partnership programs, and we need to get stronger in Africa, General Langley, but you've done an outstanding job of using that resource, which is a low-resourced, dollar-wise programs, which can be very, very effective. But it also takes, at your levels, engaging with those state partnership adjutant generals to make sure that their priorities align with your priorities in those countries that they represent. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, and just if you can comment on those.
Congressman, thanks. If I could just back up one on the IMET program, I think that's the highest return on investment for every dollar we spend, because I will tell you in the Centcom region, many of our chiefs of defense went to school at our military school of professional military education back in the States. I thank you for what Mississippi does with Uzbekistan. I think we do have great alignment, and the return on investment we get from our state partnership program is significant, and it's one of the highest requested things from a lot of our countries in the region.